It was long past midnight when the gates of the cemetery drifted open. A single hand braced against the blackened iron to slow the wide and creaking swing. It was so long after midnight, in fact, that it was closer to dawn than to dusk, and at least some of the souls filling in through the widening gap in the graveyard's barrier were at least slightly relieved that the so-called witching hour had tolled its bells far into the distant past. They had time yet to achieve their goal, but not so much that the rising sun couldn't revive them should the task take longer than anticipated. A black night it was, with only the hint of moon hidden behind a swirling mass of charcoal clouds that blocked even the faint glint of starlight from showing them the way. As such, all they had was the flashlight in each hand and a cold silence in their ears. As if the silence was too much to bear, a short man with long, dangling fingers began to absent-mindedly read off the names written on the tombstones. Nora Jones, Charlie said, his voice neither hushed nor loud, but a lost place in between. Jeremy Santos, Dorothy Reyes, Marcus Hanley, Agathar Charmelin? That's a weird name. The others said nothing in response, but the two girls of the group shivered slightly and rubbed their hands on their biceps as if they were cold mirror images of each other. Charlie's gaze flicked to one of them, the shorter one with the wavy hair that half obscured her cream-colored face. Looks like these are mostly from the 1920s, Charlie went on, and whether he was speaking to the group or to himself was anyone's guess. 1928, 1924, 1925, 1924 again. Does anybody else think it's weird that they never mentioned the cause of death on these? Why would they do that? One girl asked. Seems a little morbid, if you ask me. It's a cemetery, Lisa. A taller man said. The rims of his glasses disappeared behind wide ears, which were emphasized by his short-cropped hair. This is the very definition of morbid. But to answer your question, Charlie, they don't put cause of death on tombstones. They only do that in movies. I thought they'd do it in the past, too, Charlie responded. Like as a warning, you know? He ate the berries that were striped green and they killed him. Then you'd know not to eat the green striped berries. Makes sense to me, the taller of the girls piped in. Humanity only survives by recording our mistakes and learning from them. Well, I believe that info is reserved for police reports and medical textbooks, the tall man responded. If you'll notice, they don't even put cause of death in obituaries anymore. Sometimes they do, Charlie shot back. The others were silent for a few moments as they absent-mindedly slowed their progression amongst the tombstones. The rocky growths seemed almost to glow in the night air, a fact that none of them noticed to be, in spite of the moons being obscured by heavy clouds. Over the rolling, black and blue hills covered in freshly fallen leaves, the headstones protruded like festering sores, scattered in a way that initially seemed organized but appears more haphazard the longer one peers upon them. The grave markers vanished into the darkness of other hills, taking their strange luminescence with them. As they trudged through the valleys and atop crests, the cemetery spanned in all directions, dotted here and there by the odd tree or statuary which indicated either great wealth or immense age, though more likely old wealth. Cold wind occasionally blew, rustling the leaves and sending them tumbling down their embankments, stopped only by the stones above the ancient beds. Hey! This guy was found dead in his home only a couple years ago, a third man eventually exclaimed. He was strongly built, but also slender in a way, the kind of guy who wouldn't make you feel self-conscious, but you definitely want him on your side in a hairy situation. It says right here, Harold Manhausen, 1964 to 2014, found dead in his home of no known cause. Wait, it actually says that? The tall girl asked, stepping out of line. The others stopped and turned to the strong man. I just read it to you. But that seems like such a weird thing to... Wait, I remember this guy. I heard about him a few years back. He's the guy from Jamboree Avenue. He paused for a moment and the clouds temporarily cleared, illuminating the square block of headstone before him. And in response, he turned off his light. Seriously, none of you remember this guy? He glanced around, seemingly incredulous. His audience stood in the line on the opposite side of the tombstone, facing him but unable to read the words that only he could see. The girls at the center, and Charlie and the tall man on the outside. Roger, are you going to tell us or not? The taller girl asked, her chest rising and falling with an ever-so-quickening pace, though of excitement or fear could not be determined. I was just waiting for the right moment, Roger said with a grin. He twirled his flashlight in his hands, then handed it to the person to his left. Harold Manhausen had just turned 50 when he moved into the house on Jamberry Avenue, and it was on the very first night that he started to hear things. There were creaking floorboards, doors that drifted open when the windows were all shut, and he even started to hear his windows shut on their own, windows that he knew he'd already shut and then locked. So after a few nights of this and getting restless sleep, he called in a new home inspector. The old one had told him everything was fine, but the new one said he saw something up in the attic and he wanted to check. Harold waited for him in his living room, waited and waited, but the inspector never came down. He heard the creaks from upstairs, heard them get louder and then faster, and then they stopped. And Harold thought about going to check. But he'd worked a long day, and before he had a chance, he fell fast asleep. He woke up later to find the front door hanging open, and while the inspector's car was still parked outside, the inspector himself was nowhere to be seen. "So he called the police, right?" the girl with wavy hair asked. Well, he took a look in the attic, but there was no inspector, so he assumed the guy had left. But his car was still there. Why would the guy just abandon his car? That, my friends, is the question that Harold should have thought to ask. Maybe if he'd gone to the police earlier, they could have figured something out. But instead, he waited, and waited, and waited, hearing more of the creaks over his bed each night, more shuffling in the walls as if rats and mice were scurrying through them, or perhaps trying to gnaw through the wood and plaster of his walls. So he called an exterminator, but he too disappeared. And like the inspector before him, Harold just had the car towed to an impound lot, and he went on his way. But this time, he decided that he was going to solve the issue himself. So he climbed into his attic, and he waded through the insulation that came up to his thighs, staying on the crossbeams, searching for mice, rats, raccoons, birds, anything that could be making the racket of clattering, banging sounds that now accompanied the creaks and groans of the house. As he waded through the insulation, which rose up like a pink ocean, the walls seemed to breathe and to moan a mournful song around him. An odor was hidden in the fiberglass, and it now hit him, and he fled downstairs, locking the attic behind him, but by then, it was already too late. "What happened?" Charlie asked. Roger shook his shoulders. They say that whatever was up in his attic, it had slid down the ladder when he was up there, and when he locked the door, it didn't lock it away. It locked it out of its cage. Now the creaks were joined by dark shapes in the corners of the house, scurrying sounds not in the walls, but on his floors, and across the ceiling. An odor that traveled the house with him, or dissipated as soon as he entered a room and flicked on the lights. And then finally, 3 days after his journey into the attic, the police found him, lying in the kitchen. He was dead, and lying in a puddle of blood, which was not his own, and with no obvious wounds on his body. And that, my friends, is all we know about the unfortunate Harold Manhausen. The others all stayed silent for a few moments. The taller of the girls glanced past Roger's shoulders, and in the dim light, she saw the far-off trees that formed one side of the cemetery, feeding out into a deep black forest that could swallow a person whole and leave nothing behind. "Hey, Roger, sorry to burst your bubble, but this tombstone says Ambrose Selk, 1844 to 1921. It literally doesn't say anything that you just told us." The tall girl flinched. She hadn't realized that Kevin, the man with glasses, had crossed the other side of the tombstone and read what previously only their verbose friend could see. "What? You thought that story was real?" Roger asked with a chuckle. "Come on, man, it's a graveyard. This place is like a repository for ghost stories. I couldn't pass the opportunity to make one up." "Hey, I think I see the mausoleum," the taller girl said, pointing off to her right in the direction they'd all initially been going before Roger had veered them toward poor Ambrose's bed. "Is that the right one, Jess?" the taller man asked. "It says Virgil at the top," she answered. "That's what we're looking for, right?" "Right you are for once," he responded. "That's the tomb we are looking for." As if on cue, the clouds rolled across the light above them, and all of them but Roger, who had passed on his light, flicked their electric torches back to life. The wind rustled across the grass, making it look as if something was moving within it. But only some of the group noticed this, and they shivered. Only this time it wasn't from the cold. There was something else. and the girl with the wavy hair could sense it more keenly than anyone else. The shadows loomed amongst the tombstones as they approached the great stone structure that lay before them. It rose with walls so worn and smooth by time that they appeared to be the cloaked hood of some mostly buried giant. But in that hood, no eyes stared back, no nostrils flared, only a single square was visible, an old wooden door with an iron gate clasped over it with a heavy chain. The group paused for a moment, thinking that the chain was an odd touch, but thinking little of it as that's what chains are made to do. As they stood before it, their eyes rose with the great sweeping height of the crypt, which towered far higher than it had any reason to. There were strange, misshapen forms perched at the top, but in this light and from this angle, their distinctively ugly features could not be easily determined. The tall man with the glasses shone a flashlight upon the stone and saw, atop the monolith, a single name in arcane letters of the ancient mimicry. It was a dull and fading name of Virgil.